Northern France, May 10th, 1943. Adolf Galland pulled back on the stick, his Messerschmitt climbing steadily through 22,000 feet. The air at this altitude was thin and cold, seeping through gaps in the cockpit canopy, despite his heavy flight suit. Below him, spread across the grey-green landscape of occupied France, an American formation was returning from a bombing raid deep into German territory. He'd spotted a straggler, separated from the main group by perhaps half a kilometre. Fat. Slow-looking. The kind of target that made a fighter pilot's mouth water, the kind that promised an easy addition to his kill tally. He'd heard about these new American escorts over the past few weeks. Republic P-47s, they were called. Thunderbolts, according to intelligence reports. His squadron mates joked about them constantly during mess hall conversations and pre-flight briefings. Flying bathtubs, they called them with dismissive laughter. Milk jugs with propellers. One pilot, a young lieutenant named Schroeder, had sworn the things were so heavy they needed a running start just to get airborne, like cargo transports rather than fighters. Galland had 103 confirmed kills painted on the side of his aircraft. Small crosses, each one representing a life taken, an enemy aircraft destroyed. He'd been hunting enemy aircraft since Spain in 1937, back when the war was just a rehearsal, a testing ground for tactics and equipment. This engagement should be simple, routine even. Another kill to add to his record. He closed to within 800 meters, settling into position behind and slightly above the American fighter. The tactical textbook approach, the kind of attack run he'd executed successfully dozens of times before. The American seemed oblivious to his presence, maintaining straight and level flight like a training exercise. Perhaps the pilot was inexperienced, fresh from some American flying school and unprepared for combat against Luftwaffe veterans. Galland armed his cannon and machine guns with a flick of practiced fingers, centering the target carefully in his reflector sight. The shot was nearly perfect. Then the American rolled. Not a gentle bank or a lazy turn. A violent snap roll that flipped the aircraft inverted in less than a second, a maneuver so aggressive it seemed to defy the laws of aerodynamics. The nose dropped toward the earth like a stone released from a great height, and the P-47 accelerated away in a near-vertical dive that made Galland's eyes widen in disbelief. The speed of the dive was shocking, impossible, contradicting everything Galland understood about aircraft performance and structural limitations. He followed without thinking, instinct overriding caution. He pushed his Messerschmitt into pursuit, nosing over into a steep dive that pressed him forward against his harness straps. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly, the needle sweeping across the dial like a clock hand gone mad. 400 kilometers per hour, 450, 500. The wind noise increased to a howl, the airframe beginning to vibrate. And then his aircraft betrayed him. The control column became stiff, resistant, as if someone had poured concrete into the control linkages. The aileron pressure increased dramatically, until moving the stick felt like pushing against a brick wall, the hydraulic resistance fighting his every input. His Messerschmitt, so nimble and responsive in a turning fight, so precise in normal combat, was suddenly flying like a truck, like a transport aircraft rather than a fighter. The ailerons were approaching their design limits, the control surfaces becoming ineffective in the high-speed dive. Meanwhile, the American kept accelerating, pulling away with impossible ease, as if the laws of physics simply didn't apply to that chunky American fighter. Galland hauled back on the stick with both hands, using his full strength to overcome the control resistance. He bled off speed in a high-G pull-out that greyed his vision, that pressed him down into his seat with crushing force and made his flight suit feel like it weighed 100 kilograms. Blood drained from his head. His peripheral vision tunneled. When he finally leveled off at 12,000 feet, gasping for breath and blinking away the grey haze, the P-47 was gone. Not retreating cautiously, not damaged and trailing smoke, just gone, disappeared into the distance like it had been shot from a cannon, like it had simply teleported away. He circled once, searching the sky methodically, checking every quadrant according to his training. Nothing. The American had simply outrun him, had demonstrated a performance advantage so overwhelming it didn't seem real. Galland keyed his radio, his voice carefully neutral despite the confusion churning in his mind. "All aircraft, this is Galland. I'm returning to base. Someone bring me every intelligence file we have on the American Republic fighter, everything we've collected, everything we've captured. I want it waiting when I land." The flight back to base gave him time to think, time to replay the engagement in his mind, analyzing every detail, questioning his own observations. And what he was thinking scared him more than flak, more than enemy fighters, more than anything he'd experienced in 6 years of combat flying. Galland wasn't just a fighter pilot with good reflexes and sharp eyes. Before the war, during the years when Germany was supposedly disarmed and forbidden from building military aircraft, he'd studied engineering at the Berlin Technical Institute. Real engineering, not just the basic mechanics that every pilot learned. He understood thrust-to-weight ratios, wing-loading characteristics, power curves, structural stress limits. Numbers didn't lie, couldn't be intimidated or persuaded, and the numbers he'd just experienced in that brief engagement made absolutely no sense, according to everything he'd been taught. Back at the airfield, after parking his Messerschmitt and completing the post-flight inspection with his ground crew, he spent 3 solid hours in the intelligence office. The room was cramped and poorly lit, filled with filing cabinets stuffed with captured documents, interrogation reports and reconnaissance photographs. He pulled every scrap of information available on the P-47 Thunderbolt, spreading papers across a desk until the surface disappeared under a blanket of intelligence summaries. What he found disturbed him more than the encounter itself, more than the humiliation of being outrun by an aircraft he'd been told was inferior. Engine: Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, a massive radial engine that seemed almost comically large for a fighter aircraft. Output estimates from various intelligence sources ranged from 2,000 to 2,200 horsepower, depending on boost settings and altitude. For perspective, for comparison to what German pilots were flying, the BMW 801 engine in the Focke-Wulf 190 produced 1,700 horsepower on a good day, with everything working perfectly and the engine recently overhauled. The Americans had a 30% power advantage. 30%. That wasn't a minor edge. That was overwhelming superiority. Armament: 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing. Combined rate of fire over 100 rounds per second, a torrent of metal that could shred a target in seconds. Total ammunition capacity exceeding 3,000 rounds, enough for extended combat without worrying about conservation. German fighters typically carried 2 or 3 guns total, maybe 4 if you counted the small caliber weapons. The firepower disparity was grotesque, almost obscene. 1 P-47 carried more ammunition than 3 Messerschmitts combined. But what really caught Galland's attention, what made his engineering-trained mind start calculating implications and extrapolating consequences, was a technical detail buried deep in a report from an interrogated American pilot. The P-47 used something called a turbo supercharger, exhaust-driven, mechanically separate from the main engine. The system maintained full engine power above 25,000 feet, in the thin air where German fighters struggled and gasped like drowning men. Galland sat back in his chair, the implications washing over him like cold water. Above 7,000 meters, roughly 23,000 feet, German fighters bled performance dramatically as the air thinned and engines received less oxygen. Pilots had to choose between maintaining altitude or maintaining speed, between position and performance. You couldn't have both. Physics wouldn't allow it. The Americans apparently didn't have to choose. They could have both altitude and speed. They could loiter at high altitude with full power, waiting like hawks, then strike when and where they wanted. He pulled out a notepad and started calculating intercept geometries, working through the mathematics of air combat with the precision of an engineering student solving textbook problems. If American fighters could loiter at high altitude with full power, maintaining both energy and position, they could dictate every engagement. Dive when they wanted, attacking with the advantage of superior speed. Climb when they wanted, using that massive engine to regain altitude. Break off at will, simply accelerating away from any threat. German fighters would be reacting, always defensive, never able to force combat on their terms. The tactical implications were catastrophic, potentially war-changing. That night, working by lamplight in his quarters while other pilots slept or played cards in the mess, Galland drafted a report. Not to his immediate superior, not through normal channels, but directly to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, second only to Hitler himself in the Nazi hierarchy. The memo grew to 12 pages as Galland worked through the night. Technical specifications copied from intelligence files, tactical analysis based on his encounter and initial reports from other pilots, projected loss rates if German pilots continued using standard doctrine, standard tactics against an aircraft with these capabilities. He included diagrams, calculations, everything he could think of to make the case compelling and irrefutable. His conclusion, typed carefully on the final page: the P-47 Thunderbolt represents the most serious threat German fighter forces have faced since the beginning of operations against Britain. Immediate tactical revision required. Recommend avoidance of high-altitude combat until new tactics can be developed and disseminated. Further recommend urgent development of aircraft capable of matching American performance specifications, particularly high-altitude engine performance. He sealed the envelope himself, using red wax to mark it as urgent, and handed it personally to the courier. Then he waited for the response, for some acknowledgement that his warning had been received and understood. 8 days later, a staff car arrived at the airfield. Not a messenger with a reply. Not a telephone call or a telegram. A full staff car with a driver and an escort officer, both wearing crisp uniforms that suggested they came from headquarters staff rather than combat units. General Galland, the Reichsmarschall, requests your presence immediately. The formal phrasing made Galland's stomach tighten. Not invites or asks, but requests, which in military language meant orders. The drive to Göring's estate took 4 hours, winding through the French countryside on roads clogged with military traffic. Galland used the time to rehearse his arguments mentally, preparing for questions he anticipated. He reviewed performance data in his head, mentally practiced explaining technical concepts in simple terms, prepared responses for likely objections. He had numbers, pilot testimony, tactical analysis. Everything a rational person would need to understand the threat. He should have prepared for something else entirely. Göring kept him waiting in an anteroom for nearly 3 hours, not in a comfortable office but in a small side room with hard chairs and no windows, like a defendant waiting for trial. When Galland was finally ushered into the study, stiff from sitting and mentally exhausted from waiting, the Reichsmarschall was examining a painting, one of hundreds he'd looted from occupied territories across Europe. A Dutch master, probably worth more than everything Galland owned. Galland! Göring didn't turn around. You wrote me a very interesting report. Yes, Herr Reichsmarschall, I wanted to bring your attention to a defeatist report. Göring turned slowly, and Galland saw the anger burning in his face like barely controlled fire. A cowardly report suggesting that American mechanics and factory workers, people who build automobiles and kitchen appliances, have somehow built a fighter superior to German engineering, superior to the products of the master race. Herr Reichsmarschall, I encountered this aircraft personally. I observed its performance characteristics directly. You observed what the Americans wanted you to observe. Göring's voice rose, echoing off the study's wood-panelled walls. Psychological warfare, Galland. Simple psychology. They build one fast aircraft, probably stripped of armour and fuel tanks to reduce weight, and they send it to fly where our pilots can see it, where it can create maximum impact. Then men like you come back spreading panic and defeatism throughout the ranks. Galland chose his next words very carefully, aware that he was walking a dangerous line. Herr Reichsmarschall, I have personally collected reports from 17 other pilots across 4 different squadrons. All of them describe similar performance characteristics: the speed advantage, the high-altitude capability, the structural strength. This is not a single prototype or a propaganda stunt. These aircraft are appearing in squadron strength, dozens of them, across multiple combat zones. Göring waved his hand dismissively, rings glittering on his fingers. America cannot build sophisticated fighters. This is established fact. They make cars and washing machines and kitchen appliances. Their aircraft industry is infantile, primitive. The P-47 is a crude design, all brute force and no finesse, no sophistication. A heavier, clumsier aircraft will always lose to German fighters flown by superior pilots with superior training and superior combat doctrine. With respect, Herr Reichsmarschall, Galland pressed forward carefully, the weight appears to be structural reinforcement. Reports indicate these aircraft sustain battle damage that would destroy a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, yet they continue flying. Pilots report shooting them repeatedly, observing hits, and the Americans keep fighting, and the engine power more than compensates for the additional mass. The thrust-to-weight ratio. The Reichsmarschall's face darkened dangerously. Are you suggesting German pilots lack courage? That they are inventing excuses for poor performance, making up stories to justify their failures? Not at all, sir. I'm suggesting the enemy has introduced a weapons system we need to adapt to, just as we adapted our tactics when the Spitfire first appeared. The Spitfire? Ha ha! Göring laughed, but there was no humour in it, only contempt. The Spitfire was British, built by people who understand aircraft, who have aviation heritage. The Americans are children playing at war. This conversation is over. You will return to your command and inform your pilots that the Luftwaffe is not afraid of American farm boys flying overweight targets. Galland stood slowly. He'd been in the military long enough to recognize a dismissed man, to know when argument was futile. But he couldn't stop himself from saying one more thing, couldn't let it end without one final attempt. Herr Reichsmarschall, if we ignore this threat, if we refuse to adapt, German pilots will die unnecessarily. Good men, experienced men we cannot replace. Göring's eyes went cold, flat, empty of anything resembling human warmth. If German pilots die, General, it will be because they failed to press their attacks with sufficient determination and National Socialist spirit. Now get out. The drive back was silent. The escort officer didn't speak, perhaps sensing Galland's mood, or perhaps under orders not to engage in conversation. Galland stared out the window, watching the French countryside roll past, fields and forests and small villages, and felt a knot forming in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. He'd seen this pattern before, this collision between reality and ideology. In Spain, where he'd first seen combat. In Poland, where the blitzkrieg had worked because the enemy was unprepared. In France, where speed and surprise had overcome material disadvantages. The difference was that before, in those earlier campaigns, the Supreme Commanders had eventually been proven right. Their predictions had matched reality. This time, Galland knew with absolute certainty they were wrong. Dead wrong. And he knew exactly what was coming, what the price would be for this willful blindness. June and July of 1943 proved Galland right in the worst possible way, with a brutality that exceeded even his pessimistic projections. The reports arrived daily, sometimes hourly, transmitted by radio from combat zones and delivered by courier from field headquarters. JG-26 lost 4 aircraft over the Ruhr industrial region. JG-11 lost 6 attacking a bomber formation near Hanover. JG-2 lost an entire staffel, 12 aircraft, 12 pilots, in a single disastrous engagement over Belgium when Thunderbolts fell on them from above. The pattern was always the same, repeated with deadly consistency. German fighters would climb to intercept American bomber formations, following standard doctrine developed over years of combat. The P-47s would be waiting at altitude, sometimes as high as 30,000 feet, loitering with apparent ease in air so thin that German fighters struggled to function. The Thunderbolts would dive through the German formations with crushing, overwhelming speed, guns blazing, tracers converging, then zoom climb back to altitude before defensive maneuvers could even be executed properly. If German pilots tried to follow them up, to pursue into that high-altitude sanctuary, their engines would lose power in the thin air, coughing and gasping, while the Americans maintained full thrust from their turbo-supercharged engines. If they tried to dive away, to escape using speed, the P-47s would simply accelerate faster, their massive engines and structural strength allowing dive speeds German aircraft couldn't match without risking structural failure. It was like fighting an opponent who could teleport, who could appear and disappear at will, who was never where you expected and always where you were vulnerable. Galland read every after-action report personally, staying up late into the night in his office while candles burned down to stubs. The accounts were horrifying in their consistency, in the way they described the same tactical nightmare from different perspectives. Rolled inverted and dove away at impossible speed must have exceeded 700 kilometers per hour. Poured cannon fire into the American fighter, observed multiple strikes on fuselage and wings, aircraft continued fighting without apparent damage. 8 machine guns converging on a single point. Lieutenant Becker's aircraft disintegrated in seconds, no parachute observed. One report from Hauptmann Johannes Naumann, a veteran with 41 kills and a reputation for tactical brilliance, stopped Galland cold and made him read the paragraph 3 times. The P-47 is not an aircraft in any conventional sense. It is a flying tank with the speed of a racing car, a combination that should be impossible but clearly exists. Our current tactics are suicide against this machine. We are asking pilots to fight with one hand tied behind their backs against an opponent who can hit us but whom we cannot effectively strike back. Galland forwarded the reports to Luftwaffe headquarters with increasingly urgent recommendations attached. Change doctrine immediately, avoid high-altitude combat entirely. Develop new aircraft specifically designed to counter the P-47's advantages. Increase production of the Focke-Wulf 190, which at least had good low-altitude performance. Anything, do anything, except continue current operations. The response, when it finally came weeks later, was not what he expected or hoped for. A directive signed by Göring himself and distributed to all fighter commanders across the Reich. Reports of American fighter superiority are grossly exaggerated and damage morale. Such reports reflect defeatist attitudes that undermine National Socialist fighting spirit. Pilots will engage enemy aircraft aggressively at all altitudes using established doctrine. Any officer filing reports suggesting German aircraft inferiority will be investigated for defeatism and possible cowardice in the face of the enemy. Galland read it 3 times, each reading making the implications clearer and more horrifying. They weren't just ignoring the threat, they were forbidding anyone from acknowledging it existed. They were making it official policy to deny reality. He called a meeting of his squadron commanders that same evening. 15 men, veterans all, some with over 50 kills to their names, crowded into the briefing room. Their faces showed exhaustion, stress, the weight of watching friends die. "Gentlemen," Galland began without preamble, "I'm going to tell you something that headquarters doesn't want you to know, that they've now forbidden us to officially acknowledge. The P-47 Thunderbolt is better than our aircraft in several critical areas. Speed at altitude due to the turbo supercharger, dive performance due to structural strength and engine power, structural resistance to battle damage, firepower from 8 heavy machine guns." The room erupted immediately. Questions shouted over each other, objections, some denial, though less than Galland had expected. These men had seen the truth themselves. Galland raised his hand for silence, waiting until the noise subsided. "I've fought this aircraft myself. I've read your reports, every single one. We need to adjust our tactics immediately, regardless of what headquarters orders. Here's what we're going to do." For the next hour, he outlined a new approach developed through analysis of which engagements had succeeded and which had failed catastrophically. Avoid American fighters when possible, focusing on the bombers they were protecting. If forced to engage Thunderbolts, use slashing attacks from altitude and break away immediately. Never, under any circumstances, try to dogfight them at high altitude or engage in extended combat. Hit and run, always. "And, gentlemen," Galland added quietly, looking at each man in turn, "none of this goes in your official reports. Officially, according to anything you write down, we're engaging according to standard doctrine. We're being aggressive, we're maintaining National Socialist fighting spirit. Understood?" They understood. They also understood what it meant. The Luftwaffe's leadership had chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, had chosen ideology over reality. And the fighter pilots would pay for that choice with their lives, would die in burning aircraft, while headquarters denied the threat existed. The mathematics were inescapable. Galland knew mathematics, trusted numbers more than words, and the numbers said the Luftwaffe was being destroyed, methodically and inevitably, shot out of the sky by an enemy they weren't allowed to acknowledge was superior. By September 1943, Galland had access to loss statistics that few others saw. He spread them across his desk one evening and forced himself to look at the complete picture. June losses: 83 fighters destroyed, 47 pilots killed. July losses: 112 fighters destroyed, 68 pilots killed. August losses: 141 fighters destroyed, 92 pilots killed. The trend was accelerating. But worse than the raw numbers was the composition. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Men with 20, 30, 50 victories. Squadron leaders. Flight instructors. The core expertise of the Luftwaffe was being bled away, and for every German pilot killed, the Americans were losing perhaps one, maybe two in a good week. Galland did the calculation that kept him awake at night. At current attrition rates, the Luftwaffe's fighter force would be effectively destroyed within 18 months, not defeated in battle, simply ground down through unsustainable losses until there weren't enough experienced pilots left to function. He drafted another report, more detailed, more urgent. He included pilot testimony, loss statistics, tactical analysis, 26 pages. He never sent it. What was the point? The first report had been dismissed. The second would be too, and this one might get him court-martialed for defeatism. Instead, he did something more dangerous. He started quietly talking to other senior officers, men he trusted, men who could see what was happening. General Adolf Galland wasn't the only one noticing the pattern. Fighter commanders across the Reich were watching their units die. But no one was allowed to say it publicly. The unofficial network grew. Conversations in officers' clubs, quiet words after briefings, a conspiracy of truth-tellers in a system built on lies. They all asked the same question: how do we stop this? And none of them had an answer. February 20th through February 25th, 1944. The Americans called it Operation Argument. Luftwaffe pilots called it the slaughter. For 6 consecutive days, massive American bomber formations struck German aircraft factories. Hundreds of bombers, each one escorted by dozens of fighters. P-47s, P-38s, and the new P-51s. The Luftwaffe threw everything into the defense, every available fighter, every pilot who could still walk. Galland flew 5 missions during those 6 days. On the 3rd day, over Brunswick, he led his squadron into a formation of Thunderbolts. The Americans saw them coming. They always did. The P-47s dropped their external fuel tanks and turned into the attack. What happened next lasted perhaps 90 seconds, but Galland would remember it for the rest of his life. His wingman, Oberleutnant Franz Müller, 53 victories, died in the first exchange. One moment he was there, tucked in tight on Galland's wing. The next moment his aircraft exploded, torn apart by 50 caliber fire that hit like artillery shells. Galland rolled hard, trying to bring his guns to bear on the Thunderbolt that had killed Müller. The American pulled up effortlessly, climbing away at an angle Galland's Messerschmitt couldn't match. Another P-47 appeared from above, diving with impossible speed. Galland saw the guns firing, saw the tracers converging on his aircraft. He broke left, pulling maximum G, feeling the control stick shake with the airframe stress. Something hit his left wing. Multiple somethings. The Messerschmitt shuddered. Control response went mushy. He looked out and saw jagged holes torn through the aluminum skin, some larger than his fist. He dove. Full power, nose down, trading altitude for distance. The Thunderbolts didn't follow. They didn't need to. They'd already accomplished their mission, breaking up the German attack before it could reach the bombers. Galland coaxed his damaged fighter back to base. After landing, he counted 37 separate hits. 37 50 caliber bullets had struck his aircraft. If even 2 of them had hit his engine's cooling system, he'd be dead. That night, the statistics came in. Day 3 of Big Week. 61 German fighters destroyed. 43 pilots killed. 8 American fighters lost. Galland sat alone in his office, staring at the numbers. The mathematical reality was inescapable. At this rate, the Luftwaffe would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within months. He pulled out a bottle of schnapps from his desk drawer and poured 3 fingers into a glass. He'd given up drinking during operations years ago, but tonight he needed it. The door opened. Major Günther Rahl, another ace, walked in without knocking. He looked as exhausted as Galland felt. "We can't keep doing this," Rahl said. "I know. Half my squadron is dead or in the hospital. The replacements they're sending me have 30 hours of flight time. 30 hours, Adolf. I had 300 hours before I saw my first combat." Galland poured another glass and slid it across the desk. Rahl took it without comment. "Have you heard from headquarters?" Rahl asked. "Nothing useful. More directives about aggressive tactics, more speeches about willpower and German superiority. While we burn." They sat in silence, 2 of the Luftwaffe's best, and contemplated the end of everything they'd built. November 1944. The situation had deteriorated beyond anything Galland could have imagined 18 months earlier. German cities were rubble, the industrial base was shattered, fuel was so scarce that new pilots received perhaps 40 hours of training before being sent to combat. Most died in their first week, and the leadership was still denying reality. Galland had been promoted to General of Fighters, responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations, a position with impressive title and 0 actual authority. Göring interfered constantly, issuing contradictory orders, refusing to allocate resources where they were needed. The final insult came during a briefing at the Air Ministry. Göring, red-faced and shouting, blamed fighter pilots for cowardice, for refusing to engage, for abandoning the bombers to American attacks. Galland felt something break inside him. He stood up slowly. The room went quiet. Everyone knew that interrupting the Reichsmarschall was dangerous. "With respect, Herr Reichsmarschall, that is a lie." Göring's face went from red to purple. "What did you say?" "I said you are lying." Galland's voice was steady, calm. "Fighter pilots are not cowards. They are heroes fighting with obsolete aircraft against numerically and technologically superior forces. I told you about the P-47 in 1943. You dismissed my report as defeatist propaganda. Now we've lost thousands of pilots because you refused to accept reality." The silence in the room was absolute. No one breathed. "How dare you?" Göring started. "How dare I tell the truth?" Galland interrupted. "Someone has to. The P-47 Thunderbolt was better than our fighters when it appeared. The P-51 Mustang is even better. The Americans are producing them by the thousands while we struggle to build hundreds. And every time someone tries to tell you these facts, you accuse them of defeatism. You are relieved of command, Göring said quietly. Effective immediately. Good. Galland gathered his papers. At least now I won't have to watch more men die because you're too arrogant to admit you were wrong. He walked out. Behind him he heard Göring screaming, calling for his arrest. But the order never came. Even Göring understood that court-martialing Germany's most famous fighter pilot would be a public relations disaster. Galland was placed under house arrest instead. Forbidden from flying, forbidden from speaking publicly. Trapped while the Luftwaffe he'd tried to save collapsed completely. May 1945. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Galland sat in an American interrogation facility, answering questions from intelligence officers. You wrote a report about the P-47 in 1943, an American major said, consulting a captured document. You warned that it was superior to German fighters. I did. But German High Command dismissed it. They did. Why? Galland leaned back in his chair. Because accepting my report would mean accepting that Americans could build better aircraft than Germans. That contradicted everything Nazi ideology taught. The Americans were supposed to be inferior, mongrels, incapable of sophisticated engineering. Reality didn't matter. Only the ideology mattered. The American major made notes. How many pilots do you think died because your warning was ignored? Galland was quiet for a long moment. In 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 13,000 aircrew. Killed, wounded, captured, missing. Not all of those were fighters, but most were. And most of those died fighting American aircraft they'd been told were inferior. 13,000. 13,000 men who might have lived if we'd adapted our tactics in 1943 when I first warned about the P-47. If we'd developed new aircraft to match American capabilities. If we'd been honest about the industrial capacity we were facing. He paused, then added, I tried to save them. I wrote reports. I changed tactics within my command authority. I eventually challenged Göring directly. None of it mattered. The system was designed to reject uncomfortable truths. The American major closed his notebook. For what it's worth, General, we found your 1943 report in the archives. The technical analysis was accurate. Your loss projections were conservative. You were right about everything. Being right doesn't bring back the dead, Galland said. Adolf Galland lived until 1996. He spent his post-war years writing, lecturing, and befriending former enemies. He became close with several American P-47 pilots, men who'd been trying to kill him 50 years earlier. In interviews, he was always asked the same question. What was Germany's biggest mistake in the air war? His answer never changed. We refused to accept reality. We believed our own propaganda about German superiority and American inferiority. When evidence contradicted that belief, we rejected the evidence rather than questioning the belief. I warned about the P-47 in 1943. I described its capabilities accurately. I predicted what would happen if we didn't adapt, and I was dismissed as a defeatist. He would pause, then add, 13,000 men paid the price for that arrogance. 13,000 pilots who died fighting an enemy we'd been told was inferior, but who was actually superior in most measurable ways. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't supposed to be a great fighter. It was too heavy, too crude, too American. But it helped destroy the Luftwaffe because physics doesn't care about ideology. The story of Adolf Galland and the P-47 is more than a story about aircraft or tactics. It's a story about what happens when ideology becomes more important than truth, when comfortable lies are valued over uncomfortable facts, when warning the leadership about real threats is treated as betrayal. Galland saw the future. He tried to warn his superiors. He documented everything. He risked his career to speak truth to power. And he was ignored. 13,000 pilots died as a result. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked skill, but because their leadership refused to hear a warning that contradicted their worldview. The P-47 Thunderbolt was just an airplane, metal and rivets and oil and ammunition. But what it represented was something much more dangerous, reality crashing into ideology. And when that happens, reality always wins. The only question is how many people die before the believers finally accept the truth.